Hello from the underground. Thanks for joining as we depart from Dostoevsky's St. Petersburg for the distant future of Isaac Asimov's myriad worlds, some light years apart, worlds founded on the genius of the positronic brain, and societies kept aloft by systems of logic, by strict ways of adhering to them, and societies ultimately doomed by that very same logic. Fantastic stories. Very. And all of those woes will be told in this story, The Naked Sun, Isaac Asimov's 1956 murder mystery. Are there similarities that you can appreciate between Dostoevsky and Isaac Asimov? Yeah, I think so. I think we'll find some in the reading of this book. So let us begin with chapter the first. A question is asked. Stubbornly, Elijah Bailey fought panic. For 2 weeks it had been welling up. Longer than that even, it had been building up ever since they had called him to Washington, and there calmly told him he was being reassigned. The call to Washington had been disturbing enough in itself. It came without details, a mere summons. And that made it worse. It included travel slips directing round trip by plane, and that made it still worse. Partly, it was the sense of urgency introduced by any order for plane travel. Partly, it was the thought of the plane. Simply that. Still, that was just the beginning of the uneasiness, and as yet easy to suppress. After all, Liege Bailey had been in a plane 4 times before. Once he had even crossed the continent, so while plane travel is never pleasant, it would at least not be a complete step into the unknown. And then, the trip from New York to Washington would take only an hour. The takeoff would be from New York runway number 2, which, like all official runways, was decently enclosed, with an airlock opening to the unprotected atmosphere only after airspeed had been achieved. The arrival would be at Washington runway number 5, which was similarly protected. Furthermore, as Bailey well knew, there would be no windows on the plane. There would be good lighting, decent food, all necessary conveniences. The radio-controlled flight would be smooth. There would scarcely be any sensation of motion once the plane was airborne. He explained all this to himself and to Jessie, his wife, who had never been airborne and who approached such matters with terror. She said, "But I don't like you to take the plane, Liege. It isn't natural. Why can't you take the expressways?" "Because that would take 10 hours. Bailey's long face was set in dour lines. "And because I'm a member of the city police force and have to follow the orders of my superiors. At least I do if I want to keep my C6 rating." There was no arguing with that. Bailey took the plane and kept his eyes firmly on the news strip that unreeled smoothly and continuously from the eye-level dispenser. The city was proud of that service. News, features, humorous articles, educational bits, occasional fiction. Sometimes the strips would be converted to film. It was said, since enclosing the eyes with a viewer would be an even more efficient way of distracting the passenger from his surroundings. Bailey kept his eyes on his unreeling strip, not only for the sake of distraction, but also because etiquette required it. There were 5 other passengers on the plane. He could not help noticing that much. And each one of them had his private right to whatever degree of fear and anxiety his nature and upbringing made him feel. Bailey would certainly resent the intrusion of anyone else on his own uneasiness. He wanted no strange eyes on the whiteness of his knuckles where his hand gripped the armrest, or the dampish stain they would leave when he took them away. He told himself, "I'm enclosed. This plane is just a little city." But he didn't fool himself. There was an inch of steel at his left. He could feel it with his elbow. Past that, nothing. Well, air. But that was nothing, really. 1,000 miles of it in one direction, 1,000 in another. 1 mile of it, maybe 2, straight down. He almost wished he could see straight down, glimpse the tops of the buried cities he was passing over: New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. He imagined the rolling, low-slung cluster complexes of domes he had never seen but knew to be there, and under them, for a mile underground, and dozens of miles in every direction, would be the cities. The endless, hiving corridors of the cities, he thought, alive with people. Apartments, community kitchens, factories, expressways, all comfortable and warm with the evidence of man. And he himself was isolated in the cold and featureless air, in a small bullet of metal moving through emptiness. His hands trembled, and he forced his eyes to focus on the strip of paper and read a bit. It was a short story dealing with galactic exploration, and it was quite obvious that the hero was an Earthman. Bailey muttered in exasperation, then held his breath momentarily in dismay at his boorishness in making a sound. It was completely ridiculous, though. It was pandering to childishness, this pretense that Earthmen could invade space. Galactic exploration? The galaxy was closed to Earthmen. It was preempted by the Spacers, whose ancestors had been Earthmen centuries before. Those ancestors had reached the outer worlds first, found themselves comfortable, and their descendants had lowered the bars to immigration. They had penned in Earth and their Earthmen cousins, and Earth civilizations completed the task, imprisoning Earthmen within the cities by a wall of fear of open spaces that barred them from the robot-run farming and mining areas of their own planet. From even that. Bailey thought bitterly, "Jehoshaphat, if we don't like it, let's do something about it. Let's just not waste time with fairy tales." But there was nothing to do about it, and he knew it. When the plane landed, he and his fellow passengers emerged and scattered away from one another, never looking. Bailey glanced at his watch and decided there was time for freshening before taking the expressway to the Justice Department. He was glad there was. The sound and clamor of life, the huge vaulted chamber of the airport with city corridors leading off on numerous levels, everything else he saw and heard gave him the feeling of being safely and warmly enclosed in the bowels and wombs of the city. It washed away anxiety, and only a shower was necessary to complete the job. He needed a transient's permit to make use of the community bathrooms, but presentation of his travel orders eliminated any difficulty. There was only the routine stamping, the private stall privileges, the date carefully marked to prevent abuse, and a slim strip of directions for getting to the assigned spot. Bailey was thankful for the feel of the strips beneath his feet. It was with something amounting to luxury that he felt himself accelerate as he moved from strip to moving strip inward toward the speeding expressway. He swung himself aboard lightly, taking the seat to which his rating entitled him. It wasn't a rush hour. Seats were available. The bathroom, when he reached it, was not unduly crowded either. The stall assigned to him was in decent order, with a launderette that worked well. With his water ration consumed to good purpose and his clothing freshened, he felt ready to tackle the Justice Department. Ironically enough, he even felt cheerful. Under Secretary Albert Minim was a small, compact man, ruddy of skin and graying, with the angles of his body smoothed down and softened. He exuded an air of cleanliness and smelled faintly of tonic. It all spoke of the good things of life that come with the liberal rations obtained by those high in administration. Bailey felt sallow and raw-boned in comparison. He was conscious of his own large hands, deep-set eyes, a general sense of cragginess. Minim said cordially, "Sit down, Bailey. Do you smoke?" "Only a pipe, sir," said Bailey. He drew it out as he spoke, and Minim thrust back a cigar he had half drawn. Bailey was instantly regretful. A cigar was better than nothing, and he would have appreciated the gift. Even with the increased tobacco ration that went along with a recent promotion from C5 to C6, he wasn't exactly swimming in pipe fixings. "Please, light up if you care to," said Minim, and waited with a kind of paternal patience while Bailey measured out a careful quantity of tobacco and affixed the pipe baffle. Bailey said, his eyes on his pipe, "I've not been told the reason for my being called to Washington, sir." "I know that," said Minim, and he smiled. "I can fix that right now. You are being reassigned temporarily." "Outside New York City." "Quite a distance." Bailey raised his eyebrows and looked thoughtful. "How temporarily, sir?" "I'm not sure." Bailey was aware of the advantages and disadvantages of reassignment. As a transient in a city of which he was not a resident, he would probably live on a scale better than his official rating entitled him to. On the other hand, it would be very unlikely that Jesse and their son, Bentley, would be allowed to travel with him. They would be taken care of, to be sure. They're in New York. But Bailey was a domesticated creature, and he did not enjoy the thought of separation. Then, too, a reassignment meant a specific job of work, which was good and a responsibility greater than that ordinarily expected of the individual detective, which could be uncomfortable. Bailey had, not too many months earlier, survived the responsibility of the investigation of a murder of a spacer just outside New York. He was not overjoyed at the prospect of another such detail, or anything approaching it. He said, "Would you tell me where I'm going? The nature of your assignment? What's it all about?" He was trying to weigh the undersecretary's quite a distance, and make little bets with himself as to his new base of operation. The quite a distance had sounded emphatic, and Bailey thought, Calcutta. Sydney? Then he noticed that Minim was taking out a cigar after all and was lighting it carefully. Bailey thought, Jehoshaphat, he's having trouble telling me. He doesn't want to say. Minim withdrew his cigar from between his lips. He watched the smoke and said, "The Department of Justice is assigning you to temporary duty on Solaria." For a moment, Bailey's mind groped for an elusive identification. Solaria Asia? Solaria Australia? Then he rose from his seat and said tightly, "You mean one of the outer worlds?" Minim didn't meet Bailey's eyes. "That is right," Bailey said, "but that's impossible. They wouldn't allow an Earthman on an outer world. Circumstances do alter cases, plainclothesman Bailey. There's been a murder on Solaria." Bailey's lips quirked into a sort of reflex smile. "It's a little out of our jurisdiction, isn't it? They've requested help. From us? From Earth?" Bailey was torn between confusion and disbelief. For an outer world to take any attitude other than contempt towards the despised mother planet, or at best a patronizing social benevolence, was unthinkable. To come for help? "From Earth," he repeated. "Unusual," admitted Minim, "but there it is. They want a terrestrial detective assigned to the case. It's been handled through diplomatic channels on the highest levels." Bailey sat down again. "Why me? I'm not a young man. I'm 43. I've got a wife and child. I couldn't leave Earth. That's not our choice, plainclothesman. You were specifically asked for. I, plainclothesman Elijah Bailey, C6 of the New York City Police Force. They knew what they wanted. Surely you see why. Bailey said stubbornly, I'm not qualified. They think you are. The way you handled the Spacer murder has apparently reached them. They must have got it all mixed up. It must have seemed better than it was. Minim shrugged. In any case, they've asked for you, and we have agreed to send you. You are reassigned. The papers have all been taken care of, and you must go. During your absence, your wife and child will be taken care of at a C7 level, since that will be your temporary rating during your discharge of this assignment. He paused significantly. Satisfactory completion of the assignment may make the rating permanent. It was happening too quickly for Bailey. None of this could be so. He couldn't leave Earth. Didn't they see that? He heard himself ask in a level voice that sounded unnatural in his own ears. What kind of murder? What are the circumstances? Why can't they handle it themselves? Minim rearranged small objects on his desk with carefully kept fingers. He shook his head. I don't know anything about the murder. I don't know the circumstances. Then who does, sir? You don't expect me to go there cold, do you? And again, a despairing inner voice. But I can't leave Earth. Nobody knows anything about it. Nobody on Earth. The Silurians didn't tell us. That will be your job, to find out what is so important about the murder that they must have an Earthman to solve it, or rather, that will be part of your job. Bailey was desperate enough to say, What if I refuse? He knew the answer, of course. He knew exactly what declassification would mean to himself, and, more than that, to his family. Minim said nothing about declassification. He said softly, You can't refuse, plainclothesman. You have a job to do. For Solaria. To hell with them. For us, Bailey. For us. Minim paused. Then he went on. You know the position of Earth with respect to the Spacers. I don't have to go into that. Bailey knew the situation, and so did every man on Earth. The 50 outer worlds, with their far smaller populations, in combination that of Earth alone, nevertheless maintained a military potential perhaps 100 times greater, with their underpopulated worlds resting on the positronic robot economy. Their energy production per human was thousands of times that of Earth. And it was the amount of energy a single human could produce that dictated military potential, standard of living, happiness, and all besides. Minim said, One of the factors that conspires to keep us in that position of ignorance. Just that. Ignorance. The Spacers know all about us. They send missions enough to Earth, heaven knows. We know nothing about them except what they tell us. No man on Earth has ever as much as set foot on an outer world. You will, though. Bailey began. I can't. But Minim repeated, You will. Your position will be unique. You will be on a Solaria, on their invitation, doing a job to which they will assign you. When you return, you will have information useful to Earth. Bailey watched the Undersecretary through somber eyes. You mean to say I'm to spy for Earth? No question of spying. You need do nothing they don't ask you to do. Just keep your eyes and mind open. Observe. There will be specialists on Earth when you return to analyze and interpret your observations. Bailey said, I take it there's a crisis, sir. Why do you say that? Sending an Earthman to an outer world is risky. The Spacers hate us. With the best will in the world, and even though I'm there on invitation, I could cause an interstellar incident. The The terrestrial government could easily avoid sending me if they chose. They could say I was ill. The spacers are pathologically afraid of disease. They wouldn't want me for any reason if they thought I was sick. "Do you suppose," said 𝚤𝚘, "we try that trick?" "No. If the government had other motive for sending me, they would think of that, or something better, without my help. So it follows that it is the question of spying that is the real essential. And if that is so, there must be more to it than just a see what you can see to justify the risk." Bailey half expected an explosion, and would have half welcomed one as a relief of pressure, but 𝚤𝚘 only smiled frostily and said, "You can see past the non-essentials, it seems." But then I expected no less. The Undersecretary leaned across his desk towards Bailey. "Here is certain information which you will discuss with no one, not even the other governmental officials. Our sociologists have been coming to certain conclusions concerning the present galactic situation. 50 outer worlds, underpopulated, roboticized, powerful, with people that are healthy and long-lived. We ourselves, crowded, technologically underdeveloped, short-lived, under their domestication. It's all unstable. Everything is in the long run. This is unstable in the short run. 100 years is the most we're allowed. The situation will last our time, to be sure, but we have children. Everything will become too great a danger to the outer worlds to be allowed to survive. There are 8 billions on Earth who hate the spacers." Bailey said, "The spacers exclude us from the galaxy, handle our trade to their own profit, dictate to our government, and treat us with contempt. What did they expect? Gratitude?" "True, and yet the pattern is fixed. Revolt, suppression. Revolt, suppression, and within a century, Earth will be virtually wiped out as a populated world, so the sociologists say." Bailey stirred uneasily. One didn't question sociologists or their computers. "And what do you expect me to accomplish if all this is so?" "Bring us information. The big flaw in sociological forecasts is our lack of data concerning the spacers. We've had to make assumptions on the basis of a few spacers that have sent here. We've had to rely on what they choose to tell us of themselves, so it follows we know their strengths, and only their strengths. Damn it. They have their robots and their low numbers and their long lives, but do they have weaknesses? Is there some factor or factors which, if we but knew, would alter the sociologic inevitability of destruction? Something that could guide our actions and better the chance of Earth's survival? Hadn't you better send a sociologist, sir?" 𝚤𝚘 shook his head. "If we could send who we pleased, we would have sent someone over 10 years ago, when these conclusions were first being arrived at. This is our first excuse to send someone, and they ask for a detective, and that suits us. A detective is a sociologist, too. A rule of thumb, practicing sociologist, or he wouldn't be a good detective. Your record proves you are a good one." "Thank you, sir," said Bailey mechanically. "And if I get into trouble?" 𝚤𝚘 shrugged. "That's the risk of a policeman's job." He dismissed the point with a wave of his hand and added, "In any case, you must go. Your time of departure is set. Your ship will take you. It is waiting." Bailey stiffened. "Waiting? When do I leave?" "In 2 days." "I've got to get back to New York then. My wife—" "We will see your wife. She can't know the nature of your job, you know. She will be told not to expect to hear from you." "But this is inhuman. I must see her. I may never see her again." 𝚤𝚘 said, "What I say now may sound even more inhuman. But isn't it true that there is never a day you set about your duties on which you cannot tell yourself she may never see you again. Plainclothesman Bailey, we must all do our duty. Bailey's pipe had been out for 15 minutes. He had never noticed it. No one had more to tell him. No one knew anything about the murder. Official after official simply hurried him on to the moment when he stood at the base of the spaceship, all unbelieving still. It was like a gigantic cannon aimed at the heavens, and Bailey shivered spasmodically in the raw, open air. The night closed in, for which Bailey was thankful, like dark black walls melting into a black ceiling overhead. It was cloudy, and though he had been on Planetaria, a bright star stabbing through the rift in the cloud startled him when it caught his eyes. A little spark far, far away. He stared curiously, almost unafraid of it. It looked quite close, quite insignificant, and yet around things like that circled planets of which the inhabitants were lords of the galaxy. The sun was a thing like that, he thought, except much closer, shining now on the other side of the earth. He thought of the earth suddenly as a ball of stone with a film of moisture and gas, exposed to emptiness on every side, with its cities barely dogging to the outer rim, clinging precariously between rock and air. His skin crawled. The ship was a spacer vessel. Of course, interstellar trade was entirely in the spacer hands. He was alone now, just outside the rim of the city. He had been bathed and scraped and sterilized until he was considered safe by spacer standards to board the ship. Even so, they sent only a robot out to meet him, bearing as he did 100 varieties of disease germs from the sweltering city to which he himself was resistant, but to which the eugenically hot-housed spacers were not. The robot bulked dimly in the night, its eyes a dull red glow. Plainclothesman Elijah Bailey. That's right, said Bailey crisply, the hair on his nape of his neck stirring a bit. He was enough of an Earthman to get angry goose flesh at the sight of a robot doing a man's job. There had been 𝚤𝚑𝚘𝚘𝚘 𝚤𝚊𝚊𝚢, who had partnered with him in the spacer murder affair, but that had been different. Spacer 𝚑𝚘𝚘𝚘 had been... "You will follow me, please," said the robot, and a white light flooded a path toward the ship. Bailey followed. Up the ladder and into the ship he went, along corridors and into a room. The robot said, "This will be your room, Plainclothesman Bailey. It is requested that you remain in it for the duration of the trip." Bailey thought, "Sure. Seal me off. Keep me safe. Insulated." The corridor along which he had traveled had been empty. Robots were probably disinfecting them now. The robot facing him had probably stepped through a germicidal bath as it left. The robot said, "There's a water supply and plumbing. Food will be supplied. You will have viewing matter. The ports are controlled from this panel. They are closed now, but if you wish to view space," Bailey said with some agitation, "that's all right, boy. Leave the ports closed." He used the "boy" address the Earthman always used for robots, but the robot showed no adverse response. It couldn't, of course. Its responses were limited and controlled by the laws of robotics. The robot bent its large metal body in the travesty of a respectful bow and left. Bailey was alone in the room and could take stock. It was better than the plane, at least. He could see the plane from end to end. He could see the limits. This spaceship was large. It had corridors, levels, rooms. It was a small city in itself. Bailey could almost breathe freely. Then lights flashed and a robot's metal voice sounded over the communal and gave him specific instructions for guarding himself against takeoff acceleration. There was the push backward against webbing and a yielding hydraulic system. a distant rumble of forest jets, heated to fury by proton micropile. There was the hiss of tearing atmosphere, growing thinner and high-pitched, and fading into nothingness after an hour. They were in space. It was as though all sensation had numbed, as though nothing were real. He told himself that each second found him thousands of miles farther from the cities, from Jessie, but it didn't register. On the second day, the third, there was no way of telling time except by the intervals of eating and sleeping. There was a queer, momentary sensation of being turned inside out. It lasted an instant, and Bailey knew it was a jump. That oddly incomprehensible, almost mystical, momentary transition through hyperspace that transferred a ship and all it contained from one point in space to another, light years away. Another lapse in time, and another jump. Still another lapse, still another jump. Bailey told himself now that he was light years away. Tens of light years, hundreds, thousands. He didn't know how many. No one on Earth as much as knew Solaria's location in space. He would bet on that. They were ignorant. Every one of them. He felt terribly alone. There was the feel of deceleration, and the robot entered. Its somber, ruddy eyes took in the details of Bailey's harness. Efficiently, it tightened a wing nut. Quickly, it surveyed the details of the hydraulic system. It said, "We will be landing in 3 hours. You will remain, if you please, in this room. A man will come to escort you out and to take you to the surface of the planet, the place of residence." "Wait," said Bailey tensely. Strapped in as he was, he felt helpless. "When we land, what time of day will it be?" The robot said at once, "By Galactic Standard Time, it will be local time, boy, local time, Jehoshaphat." The robot continued smoothly. "The day on Solaria is 28.35 standard hours in length. The Solarian hour is divided into 10 decades, each which is divided into 100 centads. We are scheduled to arrive at an airport at which the day will be at the 20th centad of the 5th decade." Bailey hated that robot. He hated it for its obtuseness in not understanding, for the way it was making him ask the question directly and exposing his own weakness. "He had to," he said flatly. "Will it be daytime?" And after all that, the robot answered, "Yes, sir," and left. It would be day. He would have to step out onto the unprotected surface of a planet in daytime. He was not quite sure how it would be. He had seen glimpses of planetary surfaces from certain points within the city. He had even been out upon it for moments. Always, though, he had been surrounded by walls, or within reach of one. There was always safety at hand. Where would there be safety now? Not even the false walls of darkness. And because he would not display weakness before the spacers, he'd be damned if he would. He stiffened his body against the whipping that held him safe against the forces of deceleration, closed his eyes, and stubbornly fought panic. Chapter 2. A friend is encountered. Bailey was losing his fight. Reason alone was not enough, Bailey told himself over and over. Men live in the open all their lives. The spacers do so now. Our ancestors on Earth did it in the past. There is no real harm in lawlessness. It is only my mind that tells me differently, and it is wrong. But all that did not help. Something above and beyond reason cried out for walls and would have none of space. As time passed, he thought he would not succeed. He would be cowering at the end, trembling and pitiful. The spacers, they would send for him with filters in his nose to keep out germs. and gloves on his hands to prevent contact. They would not even honestly despise him. The spacers would feel only disgust. 𝚘𝚘 held on grimly. When the ship stopped and the deceleration harness automatically uncoupled, while the hydraulic system retracted into the wall, 𝚘𝚘 remained in his seat. He was afraid and determined not to show it. He looked away at the first quiet sound of the door of his room opening. There was the eye-cornered flash of a tall, bronze-haired figure entering. A spacer, one of those proud descendants of Earth who had disowned their heritage. The spacer spoke. "Partner Elijah!" 𝚘𝚘's head turned toward the speaker with a jerk. His eyes rounded, and he rose almost without volition. He stared at the face, at the broad, high cheekbones, the absolute calm of the facial lines, the symmetry of the body, most of all at the level look out of the nerveless blue eyes. "Daniel," the spacer said, "it is pleasant that you remember me, partner Elijah." "Remember you?" 𝚘𝚘 felt relief wash over him. This was a bit of Earth, a friend, a comfort, a savior. He had an almost unbearable desire to rush to the spacer and embrace him, to hug him wildly, and laugh and pound on his back and do all the foolish things old friends did when meeting once again after a separation. But he didn't. He couldn't. He could only step forward and hold out his hand and say, "I'm not likely to forget you, Daniel." "That is pleasant," said Daniel, nodding gravely. "As you are well aware, it is quite impossible for me, while in working order, to forget you. It is well that I see you again." Daniel took 𝚘𝚘's hand and pressed it with firm coolness, his fingers closing to a comfortable but not painful pressure and then releasing it. 𝚘𝚘 hoped earnestly that this creature's unreadable eyes could not penetrate 𝚘𝚘's mind and see that wild moment just past and not yet entirely subsided, when all 𝚘𝚘 had concentrated into a feeling of an intense friendship that was almost love. After all, one could not love as a friend this Daniel 𝚘𝚘, who was not a man after all, but only a robot. The robot that looked so like a man said, "I have asked that a robot-driven ground transport vessel be connected to this ship by air tube." 𝚘𝚘 frowned. "Air tube?" "Yes, it is a common technique, frequently used in space, in order that personnel and material be transferred from one vessel to another without the necessity of special equipment against vacuum. It would seem, then, that you are not acquainted with the technique." "No," said 𝚘𝚘, "but I get the picture." "It is, of course, rather complicated to arrange such a device between spaceship and ground vehicle, but I have requested that it be done. Fortunately, the mission on which you and I are engaged is one of high priority. Difficulties are smoothed out quickly." "And you are assigned to the murder case, too." "Have you not been informed of that? I regret not having told you at once." There was, of course, no sign of regret on the robot's perfect face. "It was Dr. Hans Fastolf, whom you met on Earth during our previous partnership and whom I hope you remember, who first suggested you as an appropriate investigator in this case. He made it a condition that I be assigned to work with you once more." 𝚘𝚘 managed a smile. Dr. Fastolf was a native of Aurora, and Aurora was the strongest of the outer worlds. Apparently, the advice of an Auroran bore weight. 𝚘𝚘 said, "A team that works shouldn't be broken up, eh?" The first exhilaration of Daniel's appearance was fading, and the expression of the compression about 𝚘𝚘's chest was returning. "I don't know if that precise thought was in his mind, partner Elijah. From the nature of his orders to me, I should think that he was interested in having assigned to work with you one who would have experience with your world, and would know of your consequent peculiarities." Peculiarities? 𝚘𝚘 frowned and felt offended. It was not a term he liked in connection with himself. So that I could arrange the air tube, for example. I am well aware of your aversion to open spaces as a result of your upbringing in the cities of Earth. Perhaps it was the effect of being called peculiar, the feeling that he had to counterattack or lose caste to a machine that drove Bailey to change the subject sharply. Perhaps it was just that lifelong training prevented him from leaving any logical contradiction undisturbed. He said, "There was a robot in charge of my welfare on board this ship. A robot," a touch of malice intruded itself here, "that looked like a robot. Do you know it?" "I spoke to it before coming on board." "What's its designation? How do I make contact with it?" "It is RX-2475. It is customary on Solaria to use only serial numbers for robots." Daniel's calm eyes swept the control panel near the door. "This contact will signal it." Bailey looked at the control panel himself, and, since the contact to which Daniel pointed was labeled RX, its identification seemed quite unmysterious. Bailey put his finger over it, and in less than a minute, the robot, the one that looked like a robot, entered. Bailey said, "You are RX-2475. "Yes, sir." "You told me earlier that someone would arrive to escort me off the ship. Did you mean him?" Bailey pointed at Daniel. The eyes of the two robots met. RX-2475 said, "His papers identify him as the one who was to meet you." "Were you told in advance anything about him other than his papers? Was he described to you?" "No, sir. I was given his name, however." "Who gave you this information?" "The captain of the ship, sir." "Who is a Solarian?" "Yes, sir." Bailey licked his lips. The next question would be decisive. He said, "What were you told would be the name of the one you were expecting?" RX-2475 said, "Daniel 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘, sir." "Good boy. You may leave now." There was the robotic bow, and then the sharp about-face. RX-2475 left. Bailey turned to his partner and said thoughtfully, "You are not telling me all the truth, Daniel." "In what way, partner Elijah?" asked Daniel. "While I was talking to you earlier, I recalled an odd point. RX-2475, when it told me I would have an escort, said a man would come for me. I remember that quite well." Daniel listened quietly and said nothing. Bailey went on. "I thought the robot might have made a mistake. I thought also that perhaps a man had indeed been assigned to meet me and had later been replaced by you. RX-2475 not being informed about this change, but you heard me check that. Your papers were described to it, and it was given your name. But it was not given your name at that, was it, Daniel?" "Indeed, it was not given my entire name," agreed Daniel. "Your name is not Daniel 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘, but R. Daniel 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘, isn't it? Or, in full, Robot Daniel 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘. You are quite correct, partner Elijah." From which it all follows that RX-2475 was never informed that you are a robot. It also follows to think of you as a man. With your manlike appearance, such a masquerade is possible. I have no quarrel with your reasoning. Then let's proceed. Bailey was feeling the germs of a kind of savage delight. He was on the track of something. It couldn't be anything much, but this was the kind of tracking he could do well. There was something he could do well enough to be called half-across space to do. He said, "Now, why should anyone want to deceive a miserable robot? It doesn't matter to it whether you are a man or robot. It follows orders in either case. A reasonable conclusion, then, is that the Sularian captain who informed the robot and the Sularian officials who informed the captain did not themselves know you are a Reuben. As I say, that is one reasonable conclusion, but perhaps not the only one. Is that true? I believe it is. All right, then. Good guess. Now what? Dr. 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘, in recommending you as my partner, allows the Sularians to think you are a human. Isn't that a dangerous thing? The Sularians, if they find out, may be quite angry. Why was it done? The humanoid robot said, "It was explained to me thus, partner Elijah. Your association with a human of the outer worlds would raise your status in the eyes of the Sularians. Your association with a robot would lower it. Since I was familiar with your ways and could work with you easily, it was thought reasonable to allow the Sularians to accept me as a man without actually deceiving them by a positive statement to the effect." Bailey did not believe it. It seemed like a kind of careful consideration for an Earthman's feelings that did not come naturally to a spacer, not even to as enlightened a one as 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘. He considered an alternative and said, "Are these Sularians well known among the outer worlds for their production of robots?" "I am glad," said Daniil, that you have been briefed concerning the inner economy of Solaria." "Not a word," said Bailey. "I can guess the spelling of the word Solaria, and there my knowledge stops." "Then I do not see, partner Elijah, what it was that impelled you to ask that question, but it is a most pertinent one. You have hit the mark. My mind stores of information includes the fact that of the 50 outer worlds, Solaria is by far the best known for the variety and excellence of robot models it turns out. It exports specialized models to all the other worlds." Bailey nodded in grim satisfaction. Naturally, Daniil did not follow an intuitive mental leap that used human weakness as a starting point. Nor did Bailey feel impelled to explain the reasoning. If Solaria turned out to be a world expert in robotics, Dr. 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘 and his associates might have purely personal reasons and very human motives for demonstrating their own prize robot. It would have nothing at all to do with an Earthman's safety or feelings. They would be asserting their own superiority by allowing the expert Solarians to be fooled into accepting a robot of Auroran handiwork as a fellow man. Bailey felt much better. Strange that all the thought, all the intellectual powers he could muster could not succeed in lifting him out of panic. And yet a sop to his own vainglory succeeded at once. The recognition of the vainglory of the spacers helped, too. He thought, Jehoshaphat, we're all human, even the spacers. Aloud, he said, almost flippantly, "How long do we have to wait for the ground car? I'm ready." The air tube gave signs of not being well adapted to its present use. Man and humanoid stepped out of the spaceship erect, moving along flexible mesh that bent and swayed under their weight. In space, Bailey imagined hazily, men transferring weightlessly from ship to ship might easily skim along the length of the tube, impelled by an initial jump. Towards the other end of the tube narrowed clumsily, its meshing, bouncing as though some giant hand had constricted it. Daniil, carrying the flashlight, got down on all fours, and so did Bailey. They traveled the last 20 feet in that fashion, moving at last into what was obviously a ground car. Daniil closed the door through which they had arrived, sliding it shut carefully. There was a heavy, clicking noise that might have been a detachment of the air tube. Bailey looked about curiously. There was nothing too exotic about the ground car. There were 2 seats in tandem, each of which could hold 3. There were doors at each end of each seat. The glossy sections that might ordinarily have been windows were black and opaque, as a result undoubtedly of appropriate polarization. Bailey was acquainted with that. The interior of the car was lit by 2 round spots of yellow illumination in the ceiling, and, in short, the only thing Bailey felt to be strange was the transmitter set into the partition immediately before the front seat, and, of course, the added fact that there were no visible controls. Bailey said, "I suppose the driver is on the other side of this partition?" 𝚑𝚘𝚘 said, "Exactly so, partner Elijah, and we can give our orders in this fashion." He leaned forward slightly and flicked a toggle switch that set a spot of red light to flickering. He said quietly, "You may start now. We are ready." There was a muted whir that faded almost at once, a very slight, very transitory pressing against the back of the seat, and then nothing. Bailey said in surprise, "Are we moving?" 𝚑𝚘𝚘 said, "We are. The car does not move on wheels, but glides along a diamagnetic force field. Except for acceleration and deceleration, you will feel nothing." "What about curves?" "The car will bank automatically to compensate. Its level is maintained when traveling up or downhill." "The controls must be complicated," said Bailey dryly. "Quite automatic. The driver of the vehicle is a robot." Bailey had about all he wanted on the ground car. He said, "How long will this take?" "About an hour. Air travel would have been speedier, but I was concerned to keep you enclosed, and the aircraft models available on Solaria do not lend themselves to complete enclosure, as does a ground car, as that in which we are now riding." Bailey felt annoyed at the other's concern. He felt like a baby in the charge of its nurse. He felt almost as annoyed, oddly enough, at 𝚑𝚘𝚘's sentences. It seemed to him that such needlessly formal sentence structure might easily betray the robotic nature of the creature. For a moment, Bailey stared curiously at 𝚑𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘 unself-conscious under the other's gaze. Daniil's skin texture was perfect. The individual hairs on head and body had been lovingly and intricately manufactured and placed. The muscle movement under the skin was most realistic. No pains, however extravagant, had been spared. Yet Bailey knew from personal knowledge that limbs and chest would be split open along invisible seams so that repairs might be made. He knew there was metal and silicone under the realistic skin. He knew a positronic brain, most advanced, but only positronic, nested in the hollow of the skull. He knew that Daniil's thoughts were only short-lived positronic currents flowing along paths rigidly designed and foreordained by the manufacturer. But what were the signs that would give that away to the expert eye that had no foreknowledge? The trifling unnaturalness in Daniil's manner of speech, the unemotional gravity that rested so steadily upon him, the very perfection of his humanity. But he was wasting time. Bailey said, "Let's get on with it, Daniil. I suppose that before arriving here, you were briefed on matters Solarian." "I was, partner Elijah." "Oh, good. That's more than they did for me. How large is the world?" "Its diameter is 9,500 miles. It is the outermost of 3 planets and the only inhabited one. Its climate and atmosphere resembles Earth. Its percentage of fertile land is higher. Its useful mineral content lower, but of course less exploited. The world is self-supported and can, with the aid of its robot exports, maintain a high standard of living." 𝚬𝚤 said. "What's the population?" 20,000 people, partner Elijah. 𝚬𝚤 accepted that for a moment, then said mildly, "You mean 20 million, don't you?" His scant knowledge of the outer worlds was enough to tell him that, although the worlds were underpopulated by Earth's standards, the individual populations were in the millions. 20,000 people, partner Elijah, said the robot again. "You mean this planet has just been settled?" "Not at all. It has been independent for nearly 2 centuries, and it was settled for a century or more before that. The population is deliberately maintained at 20,000, that being considered optimum by the Solarians themselves." "How much of the planet do they occupy?" "All the fertile portions, which is in square miles, 30 million square miles, including marginal areas, for 20,000 people. There are also some 200 million working positronic robots, partner Elijah." "Jehoshaphat, that's 10,000 robots per human." "It is by far the highest such ratio among the outer worlds, partner Elijah. The next highest on Aurora is only 50 to 1. "What can they use so many robots for? What do they want with all that food?" "Food is a relatively minor item. The mines are more important, and power production more important still." 𝚬𝚤 thought of all the robots and felt a trifle dizzy. 200 million robots. So many among so few humans. The robots must litter the landscape. An observer from without might think Solaria a world of robots altogether and fail to notice the thin human leaven. He felt a sudden need to see. He remembered the conversation with 𝚤𝚘 and the sociologic prediction of Earth's danger. It seemed far off, a bit unreal, but he remembered. His personal dangers and difficulties since leaving Earth dimmed the memory of 𝚤𝚘's voice, stating enormities with cool and precise enunciation, but never blotted it out altogether. 𝚬𝚤 had lived too long with duty to allow even the overwhelming fact of open space to stop him in his performance. Data collected from the spacer's world, or from those of a spacer robot for that matter, was the sort of thing that was already available to Earth's sociologist. What was needed was direct observation. And it was his job, however unpleasant, to collect it. He inspected the upper portion of the ground car. "Is this thing a convertible, Daniel?" "I beg your pardon, partner Elijah, but I do not follow your meaning." "Can the car's top be pushed back? Can it be made open to the sky?" He had almost said dome out of habit. "Yes, it can." "Then have it done, Daniel. I would like to take a look." The robot responded gravely. "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow that." 𝚬𝚤 felt astonished. He said, "Look, R, Daniel." He stressed the R. "Let's rephrase that. I order you to lower the top." The creature was a robot, man-like or not. It had to follow orders. But Daniel did not move. He said, "I must explain that it is my first concern to spare you harm. It has been clear to me, on the basis both of my instructions and of my own personal experience, that you would suffer harm at finding yourself in large empty spaces. I cannot therefore allow you to expose yourself to that." 𝚬𝚤 could feel his face darkening with an influx of blood, and at the time he could feel the complete uselessness of anger. The creature was a robot, and 𝚬𝚤 knew the first law of robotics well. It went, "A robot may not injure a human being, or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm." Everything else in a robot's positronic brain that any robot on any world in the galaxy had to bow to that prime consideration. Of course, a robot had to follow orders, but with one major, all-important qualification. Following orders was only the second law of robotics. It went, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Bailey forced himself to speak quietly and reasonably. I think I can endure it for a short time, Daniel. That is not my feeling, partner Elijah. Let me be the judge, Daniel. If that is an order, partner Elijah, I cannot follow it. Bailey let himself lounge back against the softly upholstered seat. The robot would, of course, be quite beyond the reach of force. Daniel's strength, if exerted fully, would be 100 times that of flesh and blood. He would be perfectly capable of withstanding Bailey without ever hurting him. Bailey was armed. He could point a blaster at Daniel, but except for perhaps a momentary sensation of mastery, that action would only succeed in greater frustration. A threat of destruction was useless against a robot. Self-preservation was only the third law. It wouldn't. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. It would not trouble Daniel to be destroyed if the alternate were breaking the first law, and Bailey did not wish to destroy Daniel. Definitely not. Yet he did want to see out the car. It was becoming an obsession with him. He couldn't allow this nurse-infant relationship to build up. For a moment, he thought of pointing the blaster at his own temple. Open the car or I'll kill myself. Oppose one application of the first law by a greater and more immediate one. Bailey knew he couldn't do it. Too undignified. He disliked the picture conjured up by the thought. He said wearily, Would you ask the driver how close in miles we are to the destination? Certainly, partner Elijah. Daniel bent forward and pushed the toggle switch, but as he did so, Bailey leaned forward too, crying out, Driver, lower the top of the car! And it was the human hand that moved quickly to the toggle switch and closed it again. The human hand held its place firmly thereafter. Panting a bit, Bailey stared at Daniel. For a second, Daniel was motionless, as though his positronic paths were momentarily out of stability in their effort to adjust to the new situation. But that passed quickly, and then the robot's hand was moving. Bailey had anticipated that Daniel would remove the human hand from the switch gently, not hurting it, reactivate the transmitter, and countermand the order. Bailey said, You won't get my hand away without hurting me. I warn you. You will probably have to break my fingers. That was not so. Bailey knew that. But Daniel's moments stopped. Harm against harm. The positronic brain had to weigh probabilities and translate them into opposing potentials. It meant just a bit more hesitation. Bailey said, It is too late. His race was won. Top was sliding back and pouring into the car. Now open was the harsh white light of Solaria's sun. Bailey wanted to shut his eyes in initial terror, but fought the sensation. He faced the enormous wash of blue and green, incredible quantities of it. He could feel the undisciplined rush of air against his face, but could make out no details of anything. A moving something flashed past. It might have been a robot, or an animal, or an unliving something caught in a puff of air. He couldn't tell. The car went past too quickly. Blue, green, air, noise, motion, and over it all, beating down, furiously, relentlessly, frighteningly, was the white light that came from the ball in the sky. For one fleeting split moment, he bent his head back and stared directly at Solaria's sun. He stared at it, unprotected by the diffusing glass of the city's uppermost level sun porches. He stared at the naked sun. And at the very moment he felt Daniil's hands clamping down on his shoulders, his mind crowded with thoughts. During that unreal, whirling moment, he had to see all he could, and Daniil must be there with him to keep him from seeing. But surely a robot would not dare use violence on a man. That thought was dominant. Daniil could not prevent him forcibly, and yet Bailey felt the robot's hand forcing him down. Bailey lifted his arms to force those fleshless hands away, and lost all sensation. On to Chapter 3. Have a drink first. Yes, homeopathic remedies, though not being as potent as anything over the counter, still effective antioxidants. You have to take a lot of it, as we are doing now, and I hope everybody is. I really do. Today's brew? Oh, this cup is so cold, you can actually hardly even taste it. Thought it was licorice. No, it's peppermint. Well, cheers. A victim is named. Chapter the 3rd. Bailey was back in the safety of enclosure. Daniil's face wavered before his eyes, and it was splotched with dark spots that turned to red when he blinked. Bailey said, "What happened?" "I regret," said Daniil, "that you have suffered harm despite my presence. The direct rays of the sun are damaging to the human eye, but I believe that the damage from the short exposure you suffered will not be permanent. When you looked up, I was forced to pull you down, and you lost consciousness." Bailey grimaced. That left the question open as to whether he had fainted out of overexcitement or fright, or had been knocked unconscious. He felt his jaw and head and found no pain. He forbore asking the question direct. In a way, he didn't want to know. He said, "It wasn't so bad. From your reaction, partner Elijah, I should touch you found it unpleasant." "Not at all," said Bailey stubbornly. The splotches before his eyes were fading, and they weren't tearing, so. "I'm only sorry I saw so little. We were moving too fast. Did we pass a robot?" "We passed a number of them. We are traveling across the 𝚘𝚘𝚘𝚘 estate, which is given over to fruit orchards." "I'll have to try again," said Bailey. "You must not in my presence," said Daniil. "Meanwhile, I have done as you requested." "As I requested." "You will remember, partner Elijah, that before you ordered the driver to lower the top of the car, you had ordered me to ask the driver how close in miles we were to the destination. We are 10 miles away now, and shall be there in some 6 minutes. Bailey felt the impulse to ask Daniil if he were angry at having been outwitted, if only to see that perfect face become imperfect, but he repressed it. Of course, Daniil would simply answer no, without rancor or annoyance. He would sit there as calm and as grave as ever, unperturbed and unperturbable. Bailey said quietly, "Just the same, Daniil. I'll have to get used to it, you know." They're all but regarded as human partner. "To what is it that you refer?" "Jehoshaphat, to the outdoors. It's all this planet is made of." "There will be no necessity for facing the outdoors," said Daniil. Then, as though that disposed of the subject, he said, We are slowing down, partner Elijah. I believe we have arrived. It will be necessary to wait now for the connection of another air tube leading to the dwelling that will serve as our base of operations. An air tube is unnecessary, Daniel. If I am to be working outdoors, there is no point in delaying the indoctrination. There will be no reason for you to work outdoors, partner Elijah. The robot started to say more, but Bailey waved him quiet with a peremptory motion of his hand. At the moment, he was not in the mood for Daniel's careful consolations, for soothings, for assurances that all will be well and that he will be taken care of. What he really wanted was an inner knowledge that he could take care of himself and fulfill his assignment. The sight and feel of the open had been hard to take. It might be that when the time came he would lack the hardihood to dare face it again, at the cost of his self-respect and, conceivably, of Earth's safety, all over a small matter of emptiness. His face grew grim, even at the glancing touch of that thought. He would face air, sun, and empty space yet. Elijah Bailey felt like an inhabitant of one of the smaller cities, say Helsinki, visiting New York and counting the levels in awe. He had thought of a dwelling as something like an apartment unit, but this was nothing like it at all. He passed from room to room endlessly. Panoramic windows were shrouded closely, allowing no hint of disturbing day to enter. Lights came to life noiselessly from hidden sources as they stepped into a room and died away as quietly when they left. So many rooms, said Bailey with wonder. So many. It's like a tiny city, Daniel. It would seem so, partner Elijah, said Daniel with equanimity. It seemed strange to the Earthman. Why was it necessary to crowd so many spaces together with him in close quarters? How many will be living here with me? Daniel said. There will be myself, of course, and a number of robots. Bailey thought. He ought to have said a number of other robots. Again, he found it obvious that Daniel had the intention of playing the man thoroughly, even for no other audience than Bailey, who knew the truth so well. And then the thought popped into a nothing under the force of a second, more urgent one. He cried, Robots? How many humans? None, partner Elijah. They had just stepped into a room crowded from floor to ceiling with book films. 3 fixed viewers with large 24-inch viewing panels set vertically were in 3 corners of the room. The 4th contained an animation screen. Bailey looked about in annoyance. He said, Did they kick everyone out just to leave me rattling around alone in this mausoleum? It is meant only for you. A dwelling such as this for one person is customary on Solaria. Everyone lives like this? Everyone. Why do they need all the rooms for? It is customary to devote a single room to a single purpose. This is the library. There is also a music room, a gymnasium, a kitchen, a bakery, a dining room, a machine shop, various repair bays and testing rooms, 2 bathrooms. Stop! How do you know all this? It is part of the information pattern, said Daniel smoothly, made available to me before I left Aurora. Jehoshaphat, who takes care of all this? He swung his arm in a wide arc. There are a number of household robots. They have been assigned to you and will see to it that you are comfortable. But I don't need all this, said Bailey. He had the urge to sit down and refused to budge. He wanted to see no more rooms. We can remain in one room if you so desire, partner Elijah. That was visualized as a possibility from the start. Nevertheless, Solarian customs being what they are, it was considered wiser to allow this house to be built. Built? Bailey started. You mean this was built for me? All this? Specially? A thoroughly roboticized economy. Yes, I see where you're going to say. What will they do with the house when all this is over? I believe they will tear it down. Bailey's lips clamped together. Of course, tear it down. Build a tremendous structure for the special use of one Earthman, and then tear down everything he touched. Sterilize the soil the human house stood on. Fumigate the air he breathed. The spacers might seem strong, but they too had their foolish fears. Daniil seemed to read his thoughts, or to interpret his expression at any rate. He said, It may appear to you, partner Elijah, that this is to escape contagion, that they will destroy the house. If such are your thoughts, I suggest that you refrain from making yourself uncomfortable over the matter. The fear of disease on the part of the spacers is by no means so extreme. It is just that the effort involved in building the house is to them very little, nor does the waste involved in tearing it down once more seem great to them. And by law, partner Elijah, this place cannot be allowed to remain standing. It is on the estate of Hannes Gruer, and there can only be one legal dwelling place on any estate, that of the owner. This house was built by special dispensation, for a specific purpose. It is meant to house us for a specific length of time, till our mission is completed. And who is Hannes Gruer? Asked Bailey. The head of Solarian security. We are to see him on arrival. Are we? Jehoshaphat, Daniil, when do I begin to learn anything at all about anything? I'm working in a vacuum, and I don't like it. I may as well go back to Earth. I may as well. He felt himself working up into resentment and cut himself short. Daniil never wavered. He merely waited his chance to speak. He said, I regret the fact that you are annoyed. My general knowledge of Solaria does seem to be greater than yours. My knowledge of the murder case itself is as limited as is your own. It is Agent Gruer who will tell us what we must know. The Solarian government has arranged this. Well, then, let's get to this Gruer. How long a trip will it be? Bailey winced at the thought of more travel, and the familiar constriction in his chest was making itself felt again. Daniil said, No travel is necessary, partner Elijah. Agent Gruer will be waiting for us in the conversation room. A room for conversation, too, Bailey muttered wryly, then in a louder voice. Waiting for us now. I believe so. Then let's get to him. Daniil. Sorry. Hannes Gruer was bald, and that without qualification. There was not even a fringe of hair at the sides of his skull. It was completely naked. Bailey swallowed and tried, out of politeness, to keep his eyes off that skull, but couldn't. On Earth, there was a continuous acceptance of spacers at the spacers' own evaluation. The spacers were the unquestioned lords of the galaxy. They were tall, bronze of skin and hair, handsome, large, cool, aristocratic. In short, they were all our Daniil 𝗚𝗏𝗏 was, but with the fact of humanity in addition. And the spacers who were sent to Earth often did look like that. Perhaps were deliberately chosen for that reason, but here was a spacer who might have been an Earthman for all his appearances. He was bald, and his nose was misshapen too. Not much, to be sure, but on a spacer even a slight asymmetry was noteworthy. Bailey said, Good afternoon, sir. I'm sorry if we kept you waiting. no harm in politeness. He would have to work with these people. He had the momentary urge to step across the expanse of room, how ridiculously large, and offer his hand in greeting. It was an urge easy to fight off. A spacer certainly would not welcome such a greeting, a hand covered with earthly germs. Gsrúðr sat gravely, as far away from Bailey as he could get, his hands resting within long sleeves, and probably there were filters in his nostrils, though Bailey couldn't see them. It even seemed to him that Gsrúðr cast a disapproving look at Daniel, as though to say, "You're a queer spacer, standing that close to an Earthman." That would mean Gsrúðr simply did not know the truth. Then Bailey noticed suddenly that Daniel was standing at some distance. At that, further than he usually did. Of course, too close. Gsrúðr might find the proximity unbelievable. Daniel was intent on being accepted as human. Gsrúðr spoke in a pleasant, friendly voice, but his eyes tended to remain furtively on Daniel, looking away, then drifting back. He said, "I haven't been waiting long. Welcome to Solaria, gentlemen. Are you comfortable?" "Yes, sir, quite," said Bailey. He wondered if etiquette would require that Daniel, as the spacer, should speak for the two, but rejected that possibility resentfully. Jehoshaphat! It was he himself who had been requested for the investigation, and Daniel had been added afterward. Under no circumstance Bailey felt he would not play the secondary to a genuine spacer. It was out of the question when a robot was involved, even such a robot as Daniel. But Daniel made no attempt to take precedence over Bailey, nor did Gsrúðr seem surprised or displeased at that. Instead, he turned his attention at once to Bailey, to the exclusion of Daniel. Gsrúðr said, "You have been told nothing, plainclothesman Bailey, about the crime for which your service have been solicited. I imagine you are quite curious about that." He shook his arms so the sleeves fell backwards and clasped his hands loosely in his lap. "Won't you gentlemen sit down?" They did so, and Bailey said, "We are curious." He noted that Gsrúðr's hands were not protected by gloves. Gsrúðr went on, "That was on purpose, plainclothesman. We wanted you to arrive here prepared to tackle the problem with a fresh mind. We wanted no preconceived notions. You will have available to you shortly a full report of the detail of the crime and of the investigations we have been able to conduct. I am afraid, plainclothesman, that you will find our investigations ridiculously incomplete from the standpoint of your own experience. We have no police force on Solaria." "None at all?" asked Bailey. Gsrúðr smiled and shrugged. "No crime, you see. Our population is tiny and widely scattered. There is no occasion for crime. Therefore, no occasion for police." "I see. But for all that, you do have crime now." "True. But the first case of violence in 2 centuries of history." "Unfortunate, then, that you must begin with murder." "Unfortunate, yes. More unfortunately still, the victim was a man we could scarcely afford to lose. A most inappropriate victim, and the circumstances of the murder were particularly brutal." Bailey said, "I suppose the murderer is completely unknown. Why else would the crime be worth the importation of an earthly detective?" Gsrúðr looked particularly uneasy. He glanced sideways at Daniel, who sat motionless, an absorptive, quiet mechanism. Bailey knew that Daniel would, at any time in the future, be able to reproduce any conversation he heard, of whatever length. He was a recording machine that walked and talked like a man. Did Gsrúðr know that? He looked at Daniel. His look at Daniel had certainly something of a furtive quality of it. Gruer said, "No, I cannot say the murderer is completely unknown. In fact, there is only one person that can possibly have done the deed." "Are you sure you don't mean to say only one person who is likely to have done the deed?" Bailey distrusted overstatement and had no liking for the armchair deducer who discovered certainty rather than probability in the workings of logic. But Gruer shook his bald head. "No, only one possibility. Anything else is impossible. Completely impossible. Completely, I assure you. Then you have no problem." "On the contrary, we do have a problem. That one person couldn't have done it either," Bailey said calmly. "Then no one did it. Yet the deed was done. 𝚖𝚤𝚘𝚘𝚘 is dead." "That's something," thought Bailey. "Jehoshaphat, I've got something. I've got the victim's name." He brought out his notebook and solemnly made note of it, partly out of a wry desire to indicate that he had scraped up at last a nubbin of fact, and partly to avoid making it too obvious that he sat by the side of a recording machine who needed no notes. He said, "How is the victim's name spelt?" Gruer spelt it. "His profession, sir?" "Fetologist." Bailey spelled that as it sounded and let it go. He said, "Now, who would be able to give me a personal account of the circumstances surrounding the murder, as first-hand as possible?" Gruer's smile was grim, and his eyes shifted at Daniel again and then away. "His wife, plainclothesman." "His wife? Yes, her name is Gladia." Gruer pronounced it in 3 syllables, accenting the second. "Any children?" Bailey's eyes were fixed on his notebook. When no answer came, he looked up. "Any children?" But Gruer's mouth had pursed up as though he had tasted something sour. He looked sick. Finally, he said, "I would scarcely know." Bailey said, "What?" Gruer added hastily, "In any case, I think you had better postpone actual operations till tomorrow. I know you've had a hard trip, Mr. Bailey, and that you are tired and probably hungry." Bailey, about to deny it, realized suddenly that the thought of food had an uncommon attraction for him. At the moment, he said, "Will you join us at our meal?" He didn't think Gruer would, being a spacer. Yet he had been brought to the point of saying Mr. Bailey rather than plainclothesman, which was something. As expected, Gruer said, "A business engagement makes that impossible. I will have no time. I am sorry." Bailey rose. The polite thing would be to accompany Gruer to the door. In the first place, however, he wasn't at all anxious to approach the door and the unprotected open. And in the second, he wasn't sure where the door was. He remained standing in uncertainty. Gruer smiled and nodded. He said, "I will see you again. Your robots will know the combination if you wish to talk to me." And he was gone. Bailey exclaimed sharply. Gruer and the chair he was sitting on were simply not there. The wall behind Gruer, the floor under his feet, changed with explosive suddenness. Daniel said calmly, "He was not there in the flesh at any time. It was a tridimensional image. It seemed to me you would know. You have such things on Earth." "Not like this," muttered Bailey. A tridimensional image on Earth was encased in a cubic force field that glittered against the backdrop. The image itself had a tiny flicker. On Earth, there was no mistaking image for reality. "Pure," No wonder Gruer had worn no gloves. He needed no nose filter, for that matter. Daniil said, "Would you care to eat now, partner Elijah?" Dinner was an unexpected ordeal. Robots appeared, once at the table, one brought in the food. "How many are there in the house, Daniel?" Bailey asked. "About 50, partner Elijah." "Will they stay here while we eat?" One head backed into a corner, his glossy, growing, red-eyed face turned toward Bailey. "It is the usual practice," said Daniil, "for one to do so in case its service is called upon. You do not wish that?" "You have only to order it to leave." Bailey shrugged. "Let it stay." Under normal circumstances, Bailey might have found the food delicious. Now he ate mechanically. He noted abstractly that Daniil ate also with a kind of unimpassioned efficiency. Later on, of course, he would empty the fluorocarbon sac within him into which his eaten food was now being stored. Meanwhile, Daniil maintained his masquerade. "Is it night outside?" asked Bailey. "It is," replied Daniil. "Indeed." "Oh," yawned Adam. Bailey stared somberly at the bed. It was too large. The whole bedroom was too large. There were no blankets to burrow under, only sheets. They would make a poor enclosure. Everything was difficult. He had already gone through the unnerving experience of showering in a stall that actually adjoined the bedroom. That was the height of luxury in a way, yet, on the other hand, it seemed an unsanitary arrangement. He said, abruptly, "How is the light put out?" The headboard of the bed gleamed with a soft light. Perhaps that was to facilitate book reading before sleeping, but Bailey was in no mood for that. "It will be taken care of once you are in bed, if you compose yourself to sleep. The robots watch, do they? It is their job." "Jehoshaphat, what do these Solarians do for themselves?" Bailey muttered. "I wonder now why a robot didn't scrub my back in the shower." With no trace of humor, Daniil said, "One would have had you required it. As for the Solarians, they do what they choose. No robot performs his duty if ordered not to, except, of course, where the performance is necessary to the well-being of the human. Well, good night, Daniil." "I will be in the other room, partner Elijah. If at any time during the night you need anything, I know the robots will come. There is a contact patch on the side. You have only to touch it. I will come too." Sleep eluded Bailey. He kept picturing the house he was in, balanced precariously at the outer skin of the world, with emptiness waiting just outside like a monster. On Earth, his apartment, his snug, comfortable, crowded apartment, sat nestled beneath many others. There were dozens of levels and thousands of people between him and the rim of Earth. Even on Earth, he tried to tell himself, there were people on the topmost level. They would be immediately adjacent to the outside, sure, but that's what made the apartments low rent. Then he thought of Jessie, 1,000 light years away. He wanted terribly to get out of bed right now, dress and walk to her. His thoughts grew mistier. If there were only a tunnel, a nice, safe tunnel burrowing its way through safe, solid rock and metal from Solaria to Earth. He would walk and walk and walk. He would walk back to Earth, back to Jessie, back to comfort and security. Security. Bailey's eyes opened. His arms grew rigid and he rose up on his elbows, scarcely aware of what he was doing. security. This man, Hans Gruer, was head of Solarian security, so Daniel had said. What did security mean? If it meant the same as it meant on Earth, and surely it must, this man Gruer was responsible for the protection of Solaria against invasion from without and subversion from within. Why was he interested in the murder case? Was it because there was no police on Solaria, and the Department of Security would come the closest of knowing what to do about a murder? Gruer had seemed at ease with Bailey, yet there had been those furtive glances again and again in the direction of Daniel. Did Gruer suspect the motives of Daniel? Bailey himself had been ordered to keep his eyes open, and Daniel might very likely have received similar instructions. It would be natural for Gruer to suspect that espionage was possible. His job made it necessary for him to suspect that in any case where it was conceivable, and he would not fear Bailey overmuch. An Earthman, representative of the least formidable world in the galaxy. But Daniel was a native of Aurora, the oldest and largest and strongest of the outer worlds. That would be different. Gruer, as Bailey now remembered, had not addressed one word to Daniel. For that matter, why should Daniel pretend so thoroughly to be a man? The earlier explanation that Bailey had posed for himself, that it was a vainglorious game on the part of Daniel's Auroran designers, seemed trivial. It seemed obvious now that the masquerade was something more serious. A man could be expected to receive diplomatic immunity, a certain courtesy, of gentleness of treatment. A robot could not. But then, why did not Aurora send a real man in the first place? Why gamble so desperately on a fake? The answer suggested itself instantly to Bailey. A real man of Aurora, a real spacer, would not care to associate too closely or for too long a time with an Earthman. But if this were true, why should Solaria find a single murder so important that it must allow an Earthman and an Auroran to come to their planet? Bailey felt trapped. He was trapped on Solaria by the necessities of the assignment. He was trapped by Earth's danger, trapped in an environment he could scarcely endure, trapped by a responsibility he could not shirk, and, to add to all this, he was trapped somehow in the midst of a spacer conflict, the nature of which he did not understand. And that leads us into chapter 4, which we'll pick up on tomorrow, which is April 16th, 17th, I believe. Yes. Till then, I hope you all take good care of yourselves. I do mean that, and I'm looking eagerly forward to a date in the not far future when we can look back to April 15th and shrug and say, well, that wasn't so bad. Right? Farewell from the underground.